Well, the media are mostly uninformed. No, they're not uninformed. They are misinformed, and they simply do not check the facts on large issues or small.
Yeah. What can we do to fix that, do you think? I mean, I suppose this,
No,
right?
no,
right?
no,
Like
yeah.
writing books like this. And
well, but I
having
think
long form.
more fundamentally, the public that votes has to itself become informed and not be so easily stampeded by slogans and a few numbers thrown around, like, women make X% of what men make and so on.
Yeah.
When I was studying that some years ago, for example, I found out that young female doctors made much less money than young male doctors. And that seemed like very odd. And so, but when you look into it, you discover that young male doctors work an average of 500 hours a year more than young female doctors, and they get paid for the 500 hours. But there's no reason why the women and men should be doing the same thing. Their circumstances are different.
So are there any laws that are in place right now that you believe are discriminatory one way or another towards any community or against any community?
Oh, I would have to write a much larger book to cover them all. The minimum wage law is absolutely devastating. The policy of saying that you cannot have more kids from one ethnic group disciplined in the school than from another is nonsense. I mean, groups are different from each other in umpteen ways, and to have the presumption that they are the same except for the way they're treated is nonsense. It's never been true, and I don't know why we would think it's true here today.
So I do sense that some of what you just said there is bubbling up into the national conscious, because I get a ton of email from black conservatives now, people that feel that they haven't been represented fairly, or that the so-called leaders of the black community that are on television all the time are actually preaching the complete reverse of everything that you've said here.
Yes.
Do you sense that there is some sort of growing conservative movement
within
the black community?
There was a time when that community consisted of me and Walter Williams. I know Walter used to say the two of us should never fly on the same plane, otherwise the whole movement will disappear if the plane goes down.
Well, I mentioned to you before we started that Larry Elder caused my awakening because I was a progressive and I said something to him about systemic racism on air, and he beat me senseless with facts, and I had to go back and reassess what was wrong with my thinking.
Well, in one of the chapters there, I have a little section about the era of apartheid in South Africa. And I had that in there because there's so much argument about how much racism is there and so forth. And I said, let's test this hypothesis in a setting where there's absolutely no doubt of it. And that's apartheid in South Africa, with a government where blacks are not allowed to vote and so forth. And you then apply the economic principles, and you find that the economic principles apply in South Africa, that there are some occupations. See, blacks weren't allowed by law to be in certain occupations more than a certain percentage, and in some occupations couldn't be hired at all. In some of those occupations where they couldn't be hired at all, well, illegal to hire them at all, there were more blacks hired than there were whites, because there are economic factors that come in, and you don't just pass a law and that automatically produces the results you want.
Yeah. Can you go into some of the economic factors that you mentioned there? Because I thought it was sort of interesting about the types of jobs that black people had and why that would affect.
Well, it's the competitiveness of the industry. In a competitive industry, discrimination in the sense that we use for anti-discrimination laws, it costs the discriminator as well as the others. Now, insofar as that price can be evaded by the discriminator, he will discriminate. For example, minimum wage laws. When you have a minimum wage law, you have more people applying for jobs in those categories than there are jobs available, because raising the wage rate causes more people to apply and employers to hire fewer because they're more expensive. And so you have a chronic surplus. Now, if you've got a chronic surplus in an industry, it costs nothing to discriminate. But if you have a competitive market, then of course it does cost something. For every person that you discriminate against who's qualified, you've got to hire somebody else, and you've got to raise that pay rate in order to get people in. So I show how competitive industries have much less discrimination than, say, regulated public utilities.
So I was wondering when I was reading it if you were ever going to talk about how now technology is also changing this. So we see a lot of these movements for $15 minimum wage, and I know why you don't think that's a great idea. But even now where we see McDonald's and some of these other places just replacing people with iPads and computers.
This has been happening. I don't know. When I grew up in Harlem, when you went into a movie theater, this is a little neighborhood movie theater in Harlem, there would be a kid who would walk down the aisle with you with a flashlight to show you to your seat, you see. And so now that we have so many compassionate people who want people to be paid a living wage, you stumble down the aisle to your seat the best way you can, because they're not going to pay you that kind of money, that's unrelated to productivity.
Yeah. What would you say to the people? I hear a growing movement of people saying, well, this is why we need a universal basic income, because technology is going to force so many people out of the workplace.
Oh, that argument has been made for centuries, and it's been proven wrong for centuries. I would ask the question, what has happened? We've moved in that direction already. We have lots of people who can live off the welfare state and not have to be productive. And how are they better people as a result of that? I saw some time back, and I haven't followed this, that young people, the suicide rates among young people were among the negative consequences of the 1960s. You've taken all meaning out of people's lives. And so they find all kinds of crazy things to do, drugs, whatever. And then, again, it's not peculiar to the United States. You find this in Britain, other countries. And so, again, people who say this almost never look at any facts about what's happened as we expanded the welfare state. Did people behave better? No. I mean, one of the things moments that I remember very well, when I was back in school in Harlem for some reason, maybe doing research, and I looked out the window and I said, when I was a teenager, I used to walk my dog in that park, and looks of horror came over the students' faces, because that was a different world. And so, and when I tell them that I used to sleep out on a fire escape on hot summer nights, who could afford air conditioning, and they think I'm a man from Mars. People did that all over New York. They did it in Washington. They did it in North Carolina. Relatives in Washington used to go down Haynes Point, down near the Jefferson Memorial, on hot summer nights and sleep there till sometime after midnight when the heat wouldn't be so bad, and they'd go home at that time. You'd be out of your mind to do that today. It'd be too dangerous.
Yeah. So how do we sort of untie some of this? So my sister right now lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, not too far from Harlem, and she's in a half rent stabilized or rent controlled building, yes, and half market price. She's on the market price, so she's paying to be in a 2-bedroom in New York City. I don't even want to tell you how expensive it is. But then there are basically half of the building that's paying next to nothing. And that, of course, incentivizes people not to get off the dole, because if you're living in a nice area on the Upper West Side, very cheap, why in the world would you ever get off the dole? How do we start solving these problems? And I know facts is your bedrock answer.
Yes.
But what can we do to get people to understand some of this stuff? Because it seems so basic to understand. If someone was giving you something that you didn't earn,
again,
it's hard to.
This is common. One of this in Europe, in England especially, it's a special problem, because you have this place where your rent is subsidized, and say you're in London, and jobs are disappearing in London, and they're opening up in Manchester. Now, if you go to Manchester, you get on a waiting list for that kind of job. And if you stay in London, you're unemployed, but your rent is low. And so you slow down the movement of people, you slow down the turnover of people in these apartments. But again, most people who talk about this don't even talk in terms of if this, then that. They talk about it as, this is how the world ought to be. Well, heck, I can think of all kinds of things of how I think the world ought to be. But unfortunately, most of those things involve a cost, a trade-off.
Do you think there's a system or a government that's doing it better, doing freedom better than we're doing it here? For all the flaws that we have in this system, is anyone doing it better than us?
Oh, there may be marginally so, but I think most of the Western world is less free than it was, say, 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
By what measurements do you view that?
Oh, just the amount of regulations, things and also by consequences. I was reading Milton Friedman's. He and his wife had a joint autobiography, and she's looking at one point. She says she looking back on the days when she would ride the IND subway in Manhattan, and what a joy it was. And she said in those long gone days, and the IND subway goes through Harlem. And Milton Friedman and his wife, when they were still courting, used to go dancing at the Savoy Ballroom. Very few people want to, and you know the famous theme song of Duke Ellington, "Take the A Train."
Mm-hmm.
The A Train goes right through Harlem on the IND line. And so Friedman, who was only 5'2", had no fear of being mugged or even accosted, and go there. And this was common. There was a black actress who used to get finished with play and her socializing afterwards. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, she said she would be taking the subway up to 155th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue by herself and walking home. Nobody does that these days. And so you have to look, one, at what are the facts? How did they change?